I'm proud to present Pim Elshoff, did I pronounce that right? We'll be talking about domain-driven design. I think this is a very interesting lecture, and I'm looking forward to it. The stage is yours. Thank you.
Yeah, domain-driven design. Technically, domain-driven design. That's it for today. So this is an overview of domain-driven design. I'm assuming most of you are familiar with this stuff. So this all here, oh, I can't point. Oh, that's so sad. So all this stuff here, that's the domain-driven design stuff. This here is not domain-driven design. There's also this overview. Now maybe you've not heard of this overview in particular, but if you look closely, you'll see that the top right stuff is actually the same as this one here. Do you see that? That's the same as this one, right? But there's also this stuff here that's also DDD. It's just different DDD, and there's the one in the middle that ties it all together. Any questions? Who'd heard of domain-driven design before? Okay, should better ask who hasn't heard of domain-driven design before. Cool. So why are you here? No, it's so domain-driven design. That's what we're going to be talking about today. This is what we're going to do. I'm going to give you a little bit of context. What is it? Why are we talking about it? And why should you care? Then we're going to look at some stuff that I think you should know. That's going to be boring. So just really power through that stuff, and then we're going to do a quiz to shake things up, and then we're going to do some actual work. So first, let me give you some context. How many people of you are back-end developers? Most of you. All right. How many of you do object-oriented programming? Again, most of you. That's nice. Out of the people who do object-oriented programming, how many of you have ever designed or created a system that consisted of several classes? How many of you think that that design was good? How many of you know that that design was good? One brave hero in our midst. I want to talk to you afterwards, because I'd like to know how you know. I'm educated in Nijmegen University in the Netherlands. I studied there for a couple of years. I won't say anything about the end result. And when I was there, I found out that Nijmegen University is not so very interested in object-oriented programming. They are very much into functional programming. They don't care so much about object-oriented programming. So out of my entire time spent there, I only had 1/6 of one semester on object-oriented programming. It was basically like what I just did at the start. Yeah, so you have classes and you can instantiate them, and there's inheritance, and there's like this private stuff and public, and oh, and there's interfaces too, and if you really care, there's also design patterns. Yes, now I feel ready for the world. So when I left university, I kind of thought I knew everything there was to know about object-oriented programming. And then I made something, and then I think to myself, is this good? I don't know. There's always this nagging feeling that whatever I made, maybe it wasn't so good. And then there was this idea of Solid that entered the PHP community. I'm a PHP developer. Who knows Solid? Oh, most of you. That's really cool. So Solid was very, very good to know, because it helps us to determine if there's maybe places where our design is not so good, that we can improve. But even if all our design passes the Solid test, we know it's not horrible, but is it any good? So that's where domain-driven design comes in. Domain-driven design. Domain in the sense that we care about what our customers, what our clients, what our stakeholders, our end users talk about. We want to know their domain, their problem space, the words they talk about, the stuff they care about, whatever happens in their language, in their world. Driven in the sense that that is going to drive the design of our system. And design in this, you get it. So domain-driven design, that's what we are going to do today. And I want to give you something before you leave this room. I want to give you an approach. Because as you saw before, all that domain-driven design stuff is too much to start with. I can tell you, yeah, go read the book, and then read the book that explains the book. There really is a book that explains the book, but that was too hard too, so there also is a book that explains the book that explains the book. It's kind of ironic that a book that says tackling complexity in the heart of software is still very complex itself. So I want to give you something that you can start using right away, today, or probably tomorrow. I want to give you an approach to start using domain-driven design concepts tomorrow. That's what we're going to do today. You ready? The sugar rush of the donuts hasn't kicked in yet. All right, let's look at the technical building blocks. Some code examples. We're first going to talk about value objects. Who's heard of value objects before? Yes, everyone. So let's skip this one. No. So value object. What is a value object? If you've heard of it, then you can tell me. What is a value object? I'll wait.
Object represented by its value, it's usually immutable, it doesn't have identity.
Doesn't have identity. It represents a value. It's immutable. That's perfect. There's one thing that I haven't heard, and that's that value objects, the classes, define the range of allowed values. Value objects are part of our strategy to make the incorrect inexpressible. Whatever is not okay should not enter memory. Let's look at an example. So here is a name. This is just a representation of what a name could be. Apparently this was sufficient for that system. If you're not used to PHP, just squint your eyes a little bit and it looks like C#. There's something interesting happening here. Do you see that there is a business rule enforced here? This value object cannot be instantiated without a valid last name. There is an explicit business rule in this code that says, unless the last name is at least a character, then this is not a name. And it cannot come into memory. Let's look at another example. So here's an email address. And from my perspective, pixel issues. Oh, interesting. Here's an email address. And this email address, again, has a business rule enforced. Unless the email address is actually valid, then this object cannot come into memory. So that means that every part of the system that uses this email address object knows that it's okay, because the incorrect is inexpressible. Every other part of the system knows that if they receive an object of type email address, then it's okay. So value objects, let me recap. Value objects represent a value from the domain. The class defines the range of allowed values such that the incorrect is inexpressible. Value objects are immutable. That means that once they are created, they cannot be changed. The value of this email address never changed, but you can create another email address. Now, I also wrote down here that value objects are easier to test. Why would value objects be easier to test? Any thoughts? Because they don't change over time. Yeah. So a good unit test, everybody knows, looks like arrange, act, assert. So the arrange part of unit tests is much simpler with value objects because there is nothing to arrange. Make sense so far? Questions about value objects? Excellent. Entities. What is an entity? Any thoughts? Something you can put in a database and get back out. Everybody uses Doctrine or Entity Framework or whatever the cool kids use these days.
An object that changes over time, and regardless of the changes, it's still the same object.
Yeah. An object that changes over time, it's still the same object. Still a little technical approach, but yeah. So it's an interesting object from the domain, something that your customers will talk about. Stuff happens to it. It changes, it evolves, it grows. +1 for that, no, okay. They have a path, a life cycle, They come into our system, maybe they leave our system at one point. They have an identity. The identity is usually not just the sum of its attributes. Usually it's something system generated because the real life version of this entity can often be too complex to put in our system. Imagine having to put every detail of a person into your system. It's probably a bit too much. Because for the purposes of whatever you're doing, something like this might be well enough. An attendee with an ID, a name, and an email address. Now, compared to the previous examples, there's one thing that stands out because it's not here. There's no rule. Because this entity is guaranteed to be consistent through its value objects. The rules are in the value objects. If you're from the C# world, just imagine a couple of null checks. Because PHP has nullable types these days. There's no rules in this thing itself because we like the rules to be in the value objects. Because value objects are so easy to test, whereas entities are slightly harder to test. Why would entities be slightly harder to test? Because they change in terms of arrange, act, assert. The arrange part might be more difficult. The act part might be more difficult. Other than that, entities, they have identity. Interesting stuff happens to them. Your customers talk about it as if it's a thing. Questions about entities? Oh, you're all so smart. It saves us time. One more thing I want to mention is services. What is a service? No thoughts. Well, a service is something that your stakeholders or customers, clients, whatever, they talk about it as if it's a thing, but it's not a thing. It has no identity, maybe not even attributes, but they kind of do talk about it as if it's a thing. Something like our invoicing, or like the registration process. They talk about it as if it's a thing, but it's not really a thing. Usually, services allow us to create cross-concern operations. More complex business rules than could fit into an entity or value object. Because entities and value objects are very limited in what they know. Imagine, for example, if we were to register an attendee, but one of the rules would be that the email address needed to be unique. There's no possible way that an entity or a value object could answer that question. So we would need something like a service, something like this, a registration that would say, well, when we want to register a new attendee, the email address must be unique. Again, a very explicit place for these rules into our system. That's very nice. But there is no simple object that can answer this question. And so we need a more complex object. So services, they are not a thing, but we kind of talk about them as if they are. And they are harder to test. Why would they be harder to test? Yeah, so arrange, act, assert. Arrange is going to be much harder because you're going to have to create all kinds of dependencies. Testing value objects, it just means you have to create a value object and probably expect some kind of exception when you do. Entities, you maybe have to create a couple of value objects and an entity, and especially if you're going to tackle cross-concern operations, you're going to need more than one entity and a service. So we prefer our business rules to be in the places that are the most simple to test. That's it for theory. Now we can do fun stuff. Let's do a quiz. Final class address. Is this an entity, a value object, a service, or something else? Your guess. I hear things in Dolby Surround. So, of course, an address is like a speech, like a public proclamation, so it has like a draft version and a real version and stuff happens to it. You collect feedback, so it's obviously an entity. Final class, bicycle service. So this is like when you bring in your bike for a repair and then they plan it and they execute it, collect feedback, so it's obviously an entity. What about street address? A value object, entity, or service? Value object. No, it's obviously an entity. Like there's this registration office in the Netherlands called the Kadaster that keeps track of all the addresses, and like once every 50 years they toss out homes that have been destroyed and reclaimed for new streets. So these come into life and then they're eventually taken out of the system, so obviously an entity. So at the very start I heard you all saying it depends, and of course it depends, because when we had a really cool customer that I loved working for, they're a social investment bank, and it's one of the first clients that I was allowed and able to do domain-driven design with. And we had an event storming session with him. It's like a modeling session where we figure out all the stuff that they talk about. And they kept talking about this word investment. And we couldn't make heads or tails of it. What does this word mean? I mean, I have an idea of what an investment is. I've seen movies. So I asked them, like, what's an investment? And then one guy told me, oh, that's like when people make money. It's like there's an intention. It doesn't evolve over time or whatever. So it was a value object. And I asked this other guy, so what's an investment? Yeah, it's like the sum of when people have made money. So that grows and it accumulates. And okay, so that's an entity. And I asked another guy, it's like, yeah, that's the process of people doing this. Okay, so it's also a service? I don't get it anymore. So it really does depend on the context. The context of what we're talking about means that the same word can mean different things, and it's all very confusing. So this is more like a warning than a quiz. I'm sorry for tricking you. But be mindful that when you hear something that makes sense to you, you don't necessarily have to be right. That's like the danger of trying to write software that aligns so closely with the business. You might not understand the business. So whatever our domain experts say, think, know, we have to be mindful of their language, their domain, not our interpretation of the domain. It's their domain. So we have to be a little bit humble. All right, stupid quiz done. Let's move on to some actual work. We're going to do a little bit of a case study. I really like going to meetings and conferences, and so I picked the subject of meetings and stuff like that to do our case study. And you already saw that with the name and the email address and the attendee. So now let's introduce the meeting. We are going to look at this meeting entity that's straight from our own code base, fortunately from a long time ago, slightly adapted, and with all the horrors that PHP has to offer. Here is our entity, meeting. It has a bunch of properties, getters and setters that are hidden for your convenience and no rules whatsoever. And strangely enough, stuff goes wrong all the time. There's still a couple of types in there. People always tell me, like, that's not actual legacy because actual PHP legacy doesn't have types. Well. So there's a couple of stuff going on here, but not anything that we can relate to really in DDD terms. So creating one of these could look something like this, and I would especially have you feast your eyes on what that program looks like. One of the gems that we can do in PHP, other languages would call it a hash map, we call it an array because everything's an array. Everybody remembers? Let's move on. So let's say we got a new requirement. A sensible requirement, if you ask me. Probably some ticket that led to this requirement that meetings cannot end before they start. So if I were to ask you to implement this, then you probably have some idea, you probably could get this working. But I promised you an approach. An approach to be able to start using domain-driven design tomorrow. It's a very complex approach. So sit tight. Whenever we get a new feature request, we implement it, and then we ship it. Okay, but if there's time, before we ship it, then we extract the rule that we implemented and the properties that are used in that rule into a value object, and then we ship it. But if there's still more time, we refactor the value object. And then we ship it. That's my approach. We implement, we extract, and we refactor. And we take the time to fix it, of course, but if there really isn't time, then we ship it. Oh, sorry, I touched it. So, implementing it, I'm not going to go through all the grunt work of how I would have implemented. You can just trust me that my implementation is somewhat correct. I implemented the rule, call it in the constructor, and we ship it. This guarantees that meetings cannot end before they start. Yes. Now, of course, because we have some time, we're going to take this rule and the properties that are touched by this rule, the start date and the end date and the start time and the end time, and we're going to create a value object for it. And we're going to take that out of our entity, and then our entity is nice and clean again, and we have a dirty value object, but we can ship it, and it would look like something like this. So our meeting has a meeting duration object. You might not fancy that word, it's the word I chose. You can always refactor it, and we can have a refactor battle using Git. But it's shippable again. We constantly stay shippable. But if we have time, then we could look at what that meeting duration class would look like. It would look something like this. The rule is checked nicely in the constructor such that it cannot come into memory if it's not okay. It doesn't look good, but it's shippable. And since we have some time, we could fix it. Suggestions for fixing this? PHP programmers in the room? Using the built-in datetime immutable. Datetime immutable. Yeah, PHP has this weird thing of there's a datetime object that's caused a lot of bugs because it's not immutable and objects are always passed by reference and all kinds of difficult stuff. But we're just going to use the immutable variant, which means we're safe from that, and it would look something like this. And it would actually be a lot easier. That's nice, isn't it? And we could ship it again. And we'd be done. Creating a meeting would look something like this. Instead of just passing stupid strings in there, we pass stupid strings into the meeting duration object through datetime immutable. Right? So that's a small example of what this approach could do for you. But of course, this wouldn't make sense because nobody has these kinds of simple things in practice. We only have difficult things in practice. So let's do something a little bit more difficult. Unless there's questions about this part. No. Let's move on. So another feature request that we could get, which could also lead to very confusing conferences, would be to say that perhaps program slots should not occur in the same room at the same time. Now we saw that this program slot, it's PHP. We're happy with it, but we're glad of getting rid of this stuff. But for now, we don't touch it. We just implement the rule. We're not going to refactor it first. We're just going to implement the rule and make sure that we can ship it. So implementing that rule, again, I'm not going to show you the grunt work. It could look something like this. Feast your eyes for 10 minutes. No, we don't have 10 minutes. This basically plays a little tournament between all the different program slots that makes sure we don't check the program slots against itself, because of course that overlaps. And then we're going to check a couple of different things. Let's just assume that given a couple of good unit tests, we can have some level of certainty that this works and that we can ship it and forget it quickly. But we have some time. And when we have some time, we extract this into a value object, the rule and the property that was touched, and then our entity is nice and clean again. And that would look something like this. Instead of passing an array, we create an object to burden this feature. So instead of an array, we now have a program object passed into here. And the program object would look like this. The same rule, just moved to a different object. And we could ship it, but we have some time, so let's make this a little bit better. Suggestions for making it better, PHP programmers or other programmers? Get rid of the array. Very good. So instead of having this array with all these keys that obviously represents an object, let's turn it into an object. And that could look something like this. Instead of having an array of arrays, we have an array of objects. And that array of objects, we have the same loop over them, we have the same tournament solution, but instead of doing all the work ourselves, we ask this slot, do you overlap with that slot? And what would that look like? Well, that could look something like this. For two slots to overlap, it would mean that the room is the same and the duration overlapped. I reused the meeting duration object that we created in the previous story. And what's interesting about this approach, I don't know, who was at the unconference Friday? Almost no one, yay. Well, it's okay, I'll skip that part then. So what's interesting here is that the language that we used to talk to our customers starts coming back into this code. So say that you have someone you can actually talk to about this code. I hope you do. You would ask them, so you say that these program slots cannot overlap. So what does overlapping mean? And they'll tell you like, well, overlapping means that they overlap in terms of room and in terms of duration. Okay. But what does overlapping means in terms of duration? And they'll tell you like, well, it's complicated. So it means that the start of So it would mean something like this. So it would mean that like either the one duration contains the start of the other, or it contains the end of the other, or the other duration contains the start of the one, or the... So it is domain language. Someone could kind of tell you this, but I do feel like there must be a simpler way to do this. Because if we look at it like, so if we have two durations, can everybody see my hands? So if we have like two durations, it would mean that either like this is happening, or this is happening, or this is happening, or this is happening. But if we think a little bit outside of the box, it means it's not this or this. And that could look something like that. Oh, that's interesting. That's a lot better. We can read this, ish. But if we look at it like that, so this kind of says that, well, the one mustn't be before the other, and the other mustn't be before the one, so that will look something like this. And now there's interesting language in here. This is something you could show your client. And they could kind of read this. They might have to squint, like the C# programmers in the room have to do. But they could kind of see that. So if the one is before the other and the other is not before the one, then they probably overlap. Right? Does anybody see the two bugs that I just created? Any ideas? What about the room? Well, the room was a level up. So we say the program slots overlap, and that means the rooms are the same and the duration overlaps. Yes? So are there any mathematicians in the room? This before part, that's mathematically correct. And my interpretation as a programmer who's somewhat math savvy-ish would say, yeah, that's what before means. But in terms of conferences, it's not so weird that if one meeting starts, if one program slot starts at 15:15 and the other ends at 15:15, that's not overlap. So even though it's mathematically correct, in this domain, it's not correct. Do you see how careful you have to be with your own interpretation of the domain? There's another bug in here that I caused because I'm refactoring, and I'm refactoring poorly. And that's, I reused this meeting duration, but there was something fishy about the original program. And that's that the date and the start time and end time are all that's there to signal when a program slot starts and ends, but there's no end date. Program slots in the current version that we're refactoring cannot transfer over midnight. So I introduced a wider allowance than was currently in the system. Now, the current system might be bugged, but we don't know that. We have to be careful and make sure that when we're refactoring, we do not alter its behavior. So we can't reuse this meeting duration. We have to create a new object, and that will look like this. We have a slot duration that correctly checks that the ending and the start overlap according to this domain. And we also must verify that the rule that was implicit in the old system is explicit in the new system. So creating a meeting looked like this, and it now looks like this. A little bit more structured, a couple of more objects to verify that we have all these rules and that our system does not produce the same tickets as before. So I wanted to show you something that you can start using tomorrow. And I hope you've seen that even though it can be rough sometimes, especially in our PHP environment where we have our entities tied to all kinds of frameworks and stuff like that, there's little things you can do. Use your value objects and don't forget the approach. Implement, extract, refactor. So tomorrow, you can take the phone, call your friends, your family, and say to them, look, I'm doing DDD. And they say, well, that's not all that, DDD is more than this. And you can say, well, technically, I'm doing DDD. Thank you. Any questions? Then you have plenty of time to move on to the next session. Thank you very much for being here, and good luck tomorrow.